Hi, this is Mike Bloom, and today I'm sitting down with Jorge Terukina in the Spanish section in the Department of Modern Languages at the College of William and Mary. And I'm asking him right now about his latest project, what he's been working on. And let's give a listen and see what it's all about.
Uh, there are different ways to approach this, but the title is something like, well, I wrote it in Spanish, right? But the title would be something like Rhetoric, Science, and Imperialism in Mexican Grandeur, which is a 1604 book by this Spaniard called Bernardo de Balbuena. And the main debate surrounding my dissertation is that critics have construed this image of Balbuena and of his book Mexican Grandeur as pertaining to Mexican cultural history and as a glorifying image of the colonial capital. Right. My dissertation, in contrast with that standing prevalent opinion, is that Balbuena should be construed as a peninsular newcomer, as a Spaniard, who subordinates his glorifying image of Mexico City to a praise of the Spanish Empire. So, now, in order to do that, my approach is different from that of most critics, who have basically focused on the referential aspects of the text, meaning how much it corresponds to what Mexico City looked like in the early 17th century. Right? My research taken me on a different path, and I decided to reconstruct, let's call them discursive models, or cognitive paradigms, if you will, which were embedded in Balbuena's mind, that's my claim, and which were totally available during the early modern period. One of them pertains to rhetoric, precisely. The other pertains to this geopolitical model of the world called the Five Zone Theory, which combines what we now would see as independent disciplines, um, including medicine, climatology, ethics, and politics. And I also excavate what would be the knowledge of the time uh, of what we would call nowadays economics. So by digging up these disciplines, these pre-modern disciplines, what I do is see how Balbuena uses, manipulates, and departs from these models, and in order to claim exactly the opposite of what critics have been saying so far. And my research shows that Balbuena is basically praising the Spanish Empire and immigrants coming from Spain to the Mexican viceroyalty, not praising Mexico City per se, nor the American-born Spaniards, like Creoles, right? So in that sense, I had a lot of fun doing this research. It was painful, of course. I had to consult a lot of what we would call Greek philosophy. A lot of my research comprises Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, etc. And I've traced those models, those ways of thinking, let's put it that way, to the early modern periods, particularly to Spain. Um, and it has been a long journey, and that's why I would like to. And I'm currently working on transforming the dissertation into a book manuscript.
Specifically about Valbuena.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So what are his years? What?
I mainly work in 16th and 17th centuries.
Mm-hmm.
This particular book by Balbuena was published in 1604.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Published in Spain?
In Mexico.
Oh, in Mexico.
And there's a nice story about that, actually, because apparently Balbuena published the book twice in 1604, and usually when we buy a book, we don't pay much attention to what surrounds the book, right? Like the prologues, nice words said by other people about the author, etc., etc. This was one of the main ways in which early modern writers and intellectuals had to position themselves within the academic world, and Balbuena, and the political world too. So Balbuena appears to have published two different versions of the book, precisely to exploit different potential patrons, both in the Viceroyalty of Mexico and in Spain. So,
So he was a government official.
he belonged to a church, but he held a very low position. And once he published Grandeza Mexicana or Mexican Grandeur, what we see is that he advances socially. So basically, part of my research entails seeing or conceptualizing a book as a tool for social advancement.
For one's own social advancement. Very
yeah.
interesting.
Totally.
Do you bring your research into any of the courses that you teach?
Mm-hmm. I've used Balbuena in a course called Nature and Empire, in which I exploited one of the models that I analyzed in my dissertation, the five-zone theory, and the aim of that course was to see how seemingly innocent and candid descriptions of nature and the inhabitants of different places were actually political statements, um, which aim to create hierarchies among different human communities.
So, okay, talking about your teaching, you teaching anything fun this year? What's the favorite thing that you're teaching right now, or what would you like to be teaching? Or
well, this semester I'm teaching a freshman seminar, which serves as an introduction to the early modern Hispanic world.
Is it in Spanish or in English?
It is conducted in Spanish, so it can be challenging at times, just because I use the texts in the older Spanish, right? And students sometimes have a very fun time trying to decode these texts.
Like El Cid?
A little, not that far removed, but we do cover texts like Columbus's log of the first journey, the second letter by Hernán Cortés, a very interesting short novella called El Abencerraje, about the reconquest of Spain, and a manual aimed at disciplining women and showing them how they should behave once they're married. So it's pretty cool.
Very nice.
Mm-hmm.
So, what else are you teaching? What do you?
What I usually do in my courses is try to exploit both a transatlantic approach and a pre-disciplinary approach, and I'm very careful in the usage of both terms. Transatlantic research and teaching entails conceptualizing the Spanish Empire as a political unit, right? And that allows us to realize more clearly that the way we've inherited literature from each country is actually a pretty recent invention from the 19th century, right? So by realizing that national literary histories are closely tied to the development of the nation state, we're able to realize that they're arbitrary, and that they have had a profound effect on the way people analyze cultural artifacts. Right? So I try to avoid that kind of national compartmentalization, and I force my students to see the similarities in the way, for instance, different texts in the 16th and 17th centuries present Muslim populations, Amerindians, how women on both sides of the Atlantic for the Spanish Empire are represented, always as inferior, as wet creatures, wet obviously coming from a Greek medical approach, right? And so on, right? So that takes care of that transatlantic aspect, but and I call the other one pre-disciplinary because sometimes we tend to forget that disciplines, just like national literary traditions, are also very recent inventions. I mean, the way we organize knowledge on this campus, for instance, is not a given and was never like that all the time. You know, like in the Middle Ages, knowledge was organized according to two levels, and it comprised seven disciplines. None of none of which I was going to say none of which survives, but that's not true. But for instance, grammar, rhetoric, astrology were part of the basic liberal arts curriculum during the Middle Ages. So that's the logic. That's the, let's say, the table that organizes logic that the early modern period inherits. And it's only after the Enlightenment that we see something like the disciplinary compartmentalization that we currently use.
So you're referring to the trivium and the quadrivium.
Exactly.
Talking about
Exactly.
this, right.
So, I mean, it's a very different way of organizing knowledge, right? And so when we talk about interdisciplinary knowledge, it's always, research or teaching, it always gets tricky depending on the period that you're working on, right? I mean, if I were doing 20th century stuff, I could claim I do sociology, medicine, ethics, and philosophy, or economics. And yet, those categories do not necessarily existed like that in the early modern period, which is my period. Right?
So now it's difficult because the people who you're actually researching are not necessarily interested in the topics within the framework that you're interested in seeing them?
It's difficult because um, if I were taking, if I were doing a BA in economics, that wouldn't help me to understand economics in the early modern period necessarily, right? Especially in the early modern period when economics was Aristotelian, pretty much, at least in Spain, right? And the main concern was the common benefit, not the private accumulation of wealth. So, and this is an issue that pertains to all disciplines. Usually, many disciplines think of themselves as atemporal, and they tend to elide courses highlighting the history of their own disciplines, right? So sometimes I have students interested in economics, but once they hear me speak about early modern economics, they're thrown off and they're confused, right? So that kind of historical specificity is important, and it's hard to reconstruct, right? But it's important for the kind of teaching and the kind of work that I want to do here at William & Mary.
Great. Okay, so last question, just for fun.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions for a good read that you maybe are reading now or that you've read in the recent past that might help me understand your topic or something about Hispanic studies or something that's fun to read that will be like, oh, this is what if you want to understand me or you want to understand what's going on, this is something I really love. Here.
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. Okay, let's try one right off the top of my head. One of the books that completely transformed the way I understand research and teaching, or scholarly work in general, is the book that my dissertation advisor wrote. It's called The Tropics of Empire by Nicholas Way Gomez. It's a totally new rereading of the scientific knowledge that guided Columbus's efforts in his transatlantic journey, and the idea of going back to the Greek sources of historically locating each specific discourse that I try to do in my research and my classes comes from that book. Yeah, that would be it, I think.
Great. Thanks.